I'm Patrick Henry Bass. I'm executive editor at Amistad, an imprint that's a part of the Harper One group at HarperCollins. Thank you all for attending this Center for Fiction event, which we will kick off with a reading from Ms. Ladee Hubbard and what I will call her masterpiece, The Rib King.
Okay, hi. So I was just going to read a very short, simple sample from, this is actually the first part of the third chapter of the book, which takes place in, it's 1914. And features Mr. Sitwell, who's the main character of this section of the book. He's the man who eventually becomes the Rib King, and he works as a groundskeeper in a house that's owned by a wealthy family, and there are three orphan boys that work in the house with him, and he's sort of taken on the role of their caregiver. One of them is missing, and he is running out to try and just find this boy. The boy went to the fair earlier in the day. So the chapter is called Needs Warning. Mr. Sitwell hurried through the garden and out the gate, headed towards the omnibus stop. As he ran, he thought about all the other orphans he'd known over the years, boys caught stealing and sent away, never to be heard from again. So many boys had come and gone since he'd started working in that house that he couldn't even recall most of their names. Their features blurred and blended in Sitwell's mind so that they all seemed sad semblances of the two who'd stood beside him on the back porch the day he arrived. Those boys had only lasted a few months before they were sent back to the asylum for stealing silverware, and ever after, the theft was how Mr. Sitwell knew that deep down he was still one of them. Because the truth was, when those other two were banished from the house, Mr. Sitwell had been stealing too. Somehow he just managed not to get caught. For the next 20 years, he'd worked in that house and never once thought to intervene, yet here he was running. What was it that made these boys different? What was it that made him run? All he could think was that it had something to do with his employer, Mr. Barclay, asking him to choose between them, that somehow it had had the effect of making him feel responsible for them, accountable not only for the answer he had come up with, but also for his own determination not to give it. The bus pulled to the curb. He climbed aboard a crowded car and found himself wedged between two men in sanitation uniforms. He paid his fare, pushed past the men, and stood near a group of women in frock coats, arguing in some Slavic language. The driver yelled, "Push back!" and Mr. Sitwell took a few more steps towards the rear of the car. He stopped next to a heavy-set man in a blue fedora. He reached for the handrail and looked down at the elderly woman in the seat in front of him, humming to herself with her eyes closed. The car lurched and rumbled down Oleana Avenue, then rounded a corner headed past the magazine. He climbed down near the park and made his way through the remnants of the fairgrounds. During the exposition, it was estimated that more than 1 million people had come to the city to see the fair, but there wasn't much to look at anymore. The entire exposition had been conceptualized as an object lesson for the modern worker, meant to demonstrate the many marvels of capitalism, a display of the collective fruits of industrial labor. Its actual construction had involved 5 years of brutal, backbreaking labor on the part of hundreds of men tasked with the arduous job of clearing an entire swamp. Several had died in the process, and for most of the survivors, the glories of the fair had not proved sufficient compensation. Much of it had been reduced to cinders not a year after the exposition closed, a casualty of a workers' strike. He walked past the brackish water of a man-made lagoon where, during the exposition, people had ridden paddle boats carved in the shape of swans. The year of the exposition was the same year Mr. Sitwell came to work for the Barclay House. He had gone to visit just once before it was burned on Colored American Day. The two other orphans brought in with him had been sent away just a few weeks before when Mamie, then a chambermaid, found him crying beneath the kitchen table following some altercation with Mr. Boudreau. She'd managed to coax him out from under the table, dried his tears, and then, in an effort to cheer him up, insisted he accompany her to hear Frederick Douglass speak. They'd ridden to the fairgrounds, pushed past the aggressive crowds, and made their way to Festival Hall. He remembered Mamie holding his hand as they walked through the front rotunda, pointing out the display tables full of charts and indices of Negro improvements since emancipation. He'd nodded at the sight of them, although in truth, he could barely read and so was able to make little sense of the progress they claimed to record. Then there was the thunder of applause, and Mr. Sitwell turned around in time to see the old man take the stage on the arm of a small white woman whose mother, Mamie explained, had written the script for the very first Tom show. For the next 2 hours, Frederick Douglass spoke in a deep, sonorous voice that reverberated throughout the hall, a memory supplanted by the rapid flutter of several hundred handheld fans in the audience. When Douglass was finished, there was more applause. People rose to their feet, and Mamie, deeply moved by the dignity of the man, had begun to cry. She and Mr. Sitwell went back outside and walked around the ethnic pavilion where exotic specimens from various lands had been invited to perform their native songs and dances for the public. Mamie bought him a box of Cracker Jacks and then, for the very first time, told him about her life before she came to work for the Barclays. She told him how her mother had been born a slave to one of Mr. Barclay's cousins, and that she'd spent her childhood working for the same people who once would have owned her. She told him that this fact had caused her mother a great deal of pain, and that she'd realized the only way to change Mamie's fate was for her to leave home. So arrangements had been made for her to come and work for the Barclays at the age of maturity, which in her case was apparently 14. She told him she missed her mother terribly, but insisted that wasn't why she was crying. Instead, it had to do with the fact that it wasn't until she'd come to the city that she'd even realized Mr. Douglass was colored. I'd heard his name spoken a few times while I was helping my mother serve dinner, always in the most disparaging terms, and always, it seemed, in conjunction with a Mr. John Brown. Somehow I must have got it in my head that the two were related. She dabbed her eye with a handkerchief. Can you imagine, Sitwell, being so ignorant? It never even occurred to me that such a Negro man could even exist. And then I think that perhaps I would have never known if my mother had not had the strength and courage to compel me to come here and leave everything I knew behind. Mr. Sitwell sat and watched her cry. They were only separated by 5 years, but what a difference that small span of time had made back then. He hadn't the slightest idea how to comfort her. But he does exist, Mr. Sitwell said. Doesn't that make you feel better? Of course it does. So why are you sad? I'm not sad. She took a deep breath as she attempted to regain control of her emotions. Then she smiled. People don't always cry because they are sad, Sitwell. You should remember that. Then they shared the box of Cracker Jacks while they stood on the boardwalk and watched the Dahomey men dance for money. Thank you. Patrik? Hey.
Ladee, thank you so much.
Yeah.
So anyone who's participating in this chat, you can only imagine what it would feel like to be a burgeoning editor. A year and a half into editing at Amistad, the esteemed imprint at HarperCollins, and to get this manuscript from Aisha Pandey, who is Lady Hubbard's genius of a literary agent who has extraordinary literary taste. And so when she sent me that project and something else, but she sent me that project, and I was headed to LA because I was dealing with a nonfiction author, and I had the luxury of reading The Rib King on the plane, and I literally would tap my neighbor, who was so foreign to what the Rib King was about. Like, can you imagine what I'm reading right now? Can you see it? And so by the time I got to LA, I immediately reached out to Aisha and said, if there's any possibility or any hope that I could have a conversation with, I think I called you Ladee,
And I get
but
that. I get
yeah, I said, but if I can have a conversation with Ms. Hubbard, and she said, you shall, you can. Or I believe once I landed there, we were going to do the conversation. I landed in LA, and then we did the conversation. So, and what was on my mind, top of mind, from reading the entire manuscript was, one, I thought about Toni Morrison, and I knew from your original, from your debut novel that, that Toni had given you the blurb and you had studied with her. But two, that Toni Morrison was discovering voices like Toni K. Bambara and Gail Jones. And and my hope was to connect with someone who would take language and bend it and take ideas and fiddle with them and to charge them to do different things. And that was it with the Rib King. And once we had that conversation, Ladee, and then you decided to come along with Amistad, which I can't be more thrilled that you did. I'm just so excited. So I'm happy to do the conversation today about tonight about the Rib King and the journey of how fiction is created between the editor and, most importantly, the author. So a lot of people may not know that the Rib King is first mentioned in the Talented Ribkins, your debut novel. How did August Sitwell, I don't want to throw too much away, how did he evolve into the character who drives so much of the narrative of the Rib King?
Right. So he is the Talented Ribkins is about a family, the Ribkins family. And so the character first emerged for me as like an idea, because all of the family members, it's a contemporary novel, all the family members at some point make reference to the Rib King as their family patriarch. And the only image they have of him is on a can of sauce, right? That's this caricature. And so I was thinking, interested in the idea of tradition and identity in the present. And for them, it's obviously a very willful construction because they are seeing in that what they have the vision and the strength to see, because it's not a very dignified image, but they all, adore the Rib King. So it was a way to talk about emblems from the past that have meaning in the present, or given their meanings in the present. So that was sort of the origin of the character in my mind. And I think it extends through the whole book, because when I started sort of expanding his story, I was very interested in talking about connections between the present and the past. And sort of, so in my mind, that figure evoked that things for me. And then I had to find a way to sort of dramatize the ideas I had about that. But that's why I started with that character. It was
Right.
something I was interested in at the
Right.
time.
And by the way, I just want to let everyone know that the Rib King has gotten 3-star reviews. It has been widely acclaimed, and people are really connecting with this narrative. And I appreciate everyone, as I'm sure Ladee does, from the Center for Fiction, who will continue to spread the word about how impactful this narrative is once you enter it. But one of the other things I wanted to impress upon is how you explore stereotypes and archetypes, especially around African American or African or, Black, color, Negro iconography in popular culture, where I thought that when I read it at first, I thought that August Sitwell was based on Uncle Ben, but it seems like he's more like Uncle Tom. And even Mamie, who is such a beautiful character, was sort of centered on the Mammy character who had no no dimensions at all, and Mamie in this novel has a lot of dimensions, and so it's so inventive. How did you settle on this theme, one of the themes for the Rip King?
Okay, well, in terms of the characters, it's very true in my mind, and actually it pertains to the entire book that I was very aware when I was writing it that if it had been told from, say, the Barclays perspective, it would be a completely different book. And all of the main characters, that the characters that are main characters for me would probably appear like very different people because
Right, and lady, just let the audience who may not have entered the Rip King understand who the Barclays are.
oh, the Barclay, in the first section of the book, it's in 1914. They're in a city in the northwest, midwest, and they all work. The main characters are all servants in the house of a wealthy, sort of once very wealthy, but their fortunes are fading white family. So, and it's true that all of the characters, in my mind, if you look at them from a different perspective, would be perceived as very distinct sort of archetypes of Black identity. So I was thinking about that, and sort of the way in which I began thinking about who they actually were was to think about what it would be like to have to inhabit those roles, to like that's how you survive in a sense, is by inhabiting these particular roles. So everyone is kind of performing, and it makes it so that they're not really seen. It's necessary, it's required of them that they perform certain roles. So I really thought about that a lot. I did not want them to be stereotypes as characters, but they are people that are aware, and I am aware that they will be mistaken for stereotypes. And
Oh,
in terms of the historic fiction, I think that part of what why I did this again, it was in response to things that were going on when I wrote it, still are, in particularly the issue of the vulnerability to racial violence of African American children. And there's a lot of African Americans are, the way they're talked about, it's often very ahistorical, so that there's this need to prove things over and over and over and over again, as if like everyone just forgot, like they forgot most of history. And so you have to prove things over again. So I was really struck by that. And so I wanted to talk about a kind of historic continuity in terms of certain themes and certain forms of representation. And that's why I was talking about the endurance of these icons that you see, like you mentioned, Uncle Ben, which actually is from much later, but Aunt Jemima and Rastus, the cream of wheat man in particular, I was thinking about. And then when I walk through the grocery store, I still see them. They're still there. They're still looking out on the counter, and what that meant, because they've been sort of ahistoricized, or else they would not still be there, one would think, right? And there's
right.
always this kind of way to people are, you're reading too much into these symbols, but I don't know why they're still there. So I wanted to talk about that, and for me, that became an emblem again, in the same way the Rib King, and the only way he's known to his descendants is through this image on this can of talking about sort of the durability of certain stereotypes and images of African American people, right?
Right.
And that they're still there, and there are very real repercussions of sort of not honestly addressing where that came from, and why it's still like peeking out from your store shelves in that way.
Right,
That's Yeah,
right, and also the whole notion of consumerism,
right, yes.
and the
Hmm.
Barclays, who are minor in the story, but the consumerism that they crave, and because of their whiteness, they have the ability um, to put plans into motion that have serious consequences for all of those characters that I think you've done a brilliant job of people getting to know intimately in part one and part two, which we'll get into later.
About the consumerism, yeah,
No,
because
no,
that's
no, no. About the impact that consumerism, that the Barclays, who were down on their luck in terms of money, and then they, and then they, and minor characters in the narrative, but once that scheme um, moves forward, whether or not they benefited from it or not, it has serious consequences on those key players who were part of the domestic staff in the Barclay home.
right. Well, I really also, just to say this too, in terms of my conceptualizing of the book itself, that I really did conceive of it in terms of at least a perception of agency on the part of the servants themselves. So that's another thing, is sort of complicity on Mr. Sitwell's part in particular. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and lady, when I read the novel, and I think we went through, I believe, 3 or 4 incarnations. You were very you had your ideas, and I supported them, and I support them always. But what I loved about it was that all of the key players, including the so-called orphans, that I don't want to give away too much of the plot, but all of what I love about the Rib King is all of the domestic staff seek action. They all have action.
Yes.
None of them are dormant. They all, for however you want to look at it, they all seek action.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. So I just want to get into this. So the novel is told into 2 distinct halves, and that's what truly fascinated me, because um, Ms. Hubbard, you're also a writer of ideas, and I profoundly support that. And so there's the August Sitwell, the groundskeeper half, and then there's the Jenny Williams, the maid half.
Mhm.
Walk us through the creative choices that you were making in creating both of those sections that would be a part of a whole novel.
Right. Well, because I was taught, because of the other themes that I was talking about, a lot of it has to do with trauma, right? And
Hmm.
dealing with trauma. And so Mr. Sitwell, his all kinds of other things happening, but throughout, again, he's trying to preserve the lives of these 3 boys,
Yeah.
and they are extremely vulnerable to different forms of violence, right, in the book, like real and symbolic. And he keeps trying to think of new ways to sort of cope with this.
Right, and lady, can you share with the audience? There's no specific city, but there were race riots that were going on, that people would, when they, if they've already entered into the Rip King, we thank you. But if you haven't entered into the Rip King, the there's a reference of Mr. Sitwell um, protecting them both from what they would go through with the Barclay household, but also there were things happening in terms of uprisings in cities. Am I
Yes,
right?
and a lot of the research for the book, again, is based in Chicago. So there was a
Hmm.
lot of, just in general, labor unrest and racial difficult people getting, in conflicts that had to do with labor, right? During that time. So one of the characters actually was recruited to come up. He's a cattle butcher, and he's African American, to be a strike breaker. So there's things like that. So there's a lot going on, and that's why Mr. Sitwell really wants the house to be preserved, so that these boys will have a safe place to work and be. So he's trying to do that. It's a pretty there is a logic to his story. And again, there's a lot of nihilism. Nihilism is actually one of the threats that the boys face, right? In terms of things that endanger them. But it also is that his narrative is pretty nihilistic. And so, because of the larger themes of the book, I did not feel that was not an accurate of what I wanted to say about sort of the African American cultural history in terms of dealing with trauma. So, in a certain respect, in my mind, the Ginny section is a response to the Sitwell section. And it's interesting to me too. I was thinking about her character. So it is a very different, um, it's very different structurally. So I wanted them to be very distinct, but also ultimately dealing with the same themes, and the portrait of the world to reflect sort of Ginny's experience of it versus Mr. Sitwell's experience of it. And also, what comes out in the book is that his nihilism becomes part of her trauma. It becomes part of what he does, becomes part of what she has to struggle to sort of not let bring her down. Do you know? So that was a big part of it too. But that
Right.
was my thoughts, that you know, in my mind, in a certain respect, her section is a response to his section.
Right, because Jenny meets the Sitwell in terms of the narrative, you know, from where you know, sit with it. She meets the two Mr. Sitwells that no one has ever met, because there are people who've met Mr. Sitwell in the first part that will never meet the Sitwell in the second part that Jenny meets.
You mean the rich?
But there's another. I don't want to give too much away in terms of the storytelling. There are other characters who will meet him in the second part. I don't want to give it away.
There are other, right, there are characters from
That
the
they have met.
first part,
They've
and
met
they're
both.
also in the second
They've
part.
met both. They've met
Yeah.
both sides of him in terms of the trauma. But
Right.
what I love about Jenny is her entrepreneurial spirit. You know, uh, if y'all haven't read The Rip King, y'all need to read it. I'm just saying, because there's something that happens that is, uh, when you get to that place in the narrative, it will stop you from doing everything you're doing, whether it's the audio, the ebook, or the physical book. Um, and then Jenny goes on, and then you Jenny moves on. She's busy, she's entrepreneurial, she has an idea, she has learned from Mamie in that kitchen, she goes on. And were there any people that you personally drew upon, or was there anyone that you were thinking about in the creation of the Jenny character?
Yeah, there are very, very many people that I was thinking about. Yeah, just there were a lot of like, she's a black woman entrepreneur and inventors. There were a lot of people that sort of defied logic, in a sense, of the world, to go on and created all these things and made enormous contributions to American cultural history as a whole. So she's kind of my tribute to that, the spirit of just going on. And you know, being able to reconceptualize yourself as a matter of survival. So like when I was talking about in the first part, that a lot of people are performing, and Ginny, the character, when the book begins, this is the first time she's been a maid. She was literally a cakewalk delineator. She was a performer. Before that, she performed with her daughter. I was thinking this because you were talking about names and not knowing Mr. Sitwell, because it comes up very early that is not actually his name.
Well,
And
I
he
didn't want
will
to give
not.
that away, but
Well, it comes out pretty
it
early.
does, it does, it
He
does.
won't
Yeah,
tell anyone his name,
yeah,
because, and you were mentioning, you know, the riots. He is the sole survivor, so far as he knows, of a town that was destroyed in the South
yeah.
due to racial violence, and that's why he fled as a child to this city. He was trying to get away, and he won't tell anyone who he is. So there's also a distinction in there that's made between performing and hiding, because he's part of he's hiding, he's performing in certain sense, but he's also hiding, he's hiding from himself, and that's part of the difficulty. Whereas Ginny also performs all the time, she does what she has to do to survive, but she's not hiding from herself. Like, she has a very clear sense of who she is and what she's been through, and to a certain extent I feel like that's a very self-sustaining aspect of her personality, right? Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. When I'm not sure whether we've talked about this or not, lady, but I'm hoping I brought this up. But Jenny reminded me a bit of Ethel Waters if her talent hadn't taken her. Have we talked about this?
Mm-mm, mm-mm. Ethel
If
Waters.
Ethel Waters' talent hadn't taken her to the heights where it took her, where she became like one of the first Black female superstars in terms of entertainment,
Mhm.
because there was no one who did what she did in terms of vaudeville and all of these other incarnations of her immense talent.
Mhm.
And she just completely recreated herself,
A
no
lot
matter,
of people did.
like, there had never been a film superstar, but at the Waters at like 42, which is young these days, but she was, she felt like I could be a star because there was no one who came before her. And I
Sure.
love that entrepreneurial energy of Jenny. But what I also love was how deeply and exhaustively researched the Rib King is without feeling that way. I mean, you really went through like gaslights and um, just tell me the masks. Tell me about the research that you did to create this wonderful narrative that people now can hold in their hands or listen to or read digitally.
Well, there's a lot of research involved in it. I have an ancient PhD in folklore and mythology, and I actually did my dissertation on the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. And when I did that, I was actually interested in the origins of leisure travel and mass tourism because I grew up partially in the Virgin Islands. I was very interested in like when did people start, when did the idea as that not just something that the super wealthy do, that you travel, you go visit place, you're a tourist. And that came up a lot, the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. And so I had done a lot of research on it, and in the process of doing that, learned a lot about sort of commodity culture, the origins of it in the United States as well, because the things that were allowing people to travel more, making it easier for people to migrate to different places, were also making the circulation of and diffusion of commodities in the United States possible as well. So that was like a foundational thing in terms of my associations with that time period. And then I have done actually a lot of research too on performers and performances, and on minstrelsy in general. And I've been very interested in sort of the idea of Black minstrels, that you have, because it comes up here a lot in New Orleans because of Zulu, but this tradition of Black performers in blackface, and there's some really fascinating, because you were mentioning performers. There's actually some really not just people that did that, but just in general, just very interesting things that people were doing in terms of the performance of race during that period, in the arts, like in music as well. So in music and in theater and things like that. So that's something I have had a long-standing interest in. And then part of the reason it was fun to write a historical novel, which I've never done before, is because I had to do a lot of research just to answer basic questions, right? Like in terms of how would you get from point A to point B at that time, would you, is it a horse and buggy? Is it like, what did they call, like omnibus? I'd never heard that term before I did research for this. Or how did they light their homes at that particular time? So I had to do a lot of research just to be able to sort of conceptualize sort of space and the environment in my mind, and what did people wear, how much did things cost, and things like that. So that was fun for me, doing all of that research.
And I have to tell you, as an editor, I think I've mentioned this in one of our conversations before. I've never done as much research as an editor in terms of what an author is offering, so I can make sure that I had a sense of time and
Mm,
space. And I don't know whether I've mentioned this or not to you, but one of the novels, I think I mentioned this, maybe I did. I went back to Booth Tarkington's The Magnificent Ambersons, and
mhm,
how that white family lost all their wealth in Indiana. And he never thought about their Black servants ever, So I would go back, I would like, what does it mean to be, to lose your status, your prominence, the humiliation, the embarrassment? What would you have done? And then you have these rich characters, Mamie and Jenny and August Sitwell, the, the three orphan the boys who, um, in part two, you will get to see what happens with them. Um, so yeah, so I was just as an editor, I was constantly inspired by everything that you were giving me. I didn't want to put all that into my notes or whatever, um, but yeah, I was constantly inspired um, through this process and this journey. So there's a novel within a novel in The Rip King, and I love those devices. I love that from John Irving, you
Mm.
know, the first John Irving novel I discovered, and when I was in high school. And so I love that, like a novel within a novel. And I remember reading something from Ntozake Shange and what she did in one of her performative plays. She wrote a play within a play. But how did that come about for you?
Well, it had to do again with the way I wanted to talk about the past in relation to the present and the need for proof. Because there is no record of I wanted to talk about the discrepancy between Mr. Sitwell's recollection of what happened, for which there is no official record, and sort of the official record of history, right? That he's been excised from. And it's actually the realization that what he feels he knows is the truth of what happened is so distorted, is coming back to him in such a distorted form. That's actually part of his trauma, that increasingly it bothers him more and more. It's not the erasure, it's the lie that covers up the erasure. Do you see that it's
Right.
replaced?
And
Yeah.
and
So,
and,
but
and
also I wanted to mention this to you because I wanted to mention this to you because I think the specific form of it is because that I think I have mentioned this, that it happened. One of my ancestors who was a slave, and I don't have any other real, except for his name mentioned in court documents, that he was actually a character in a novel in the 1830s. And the novel, not the 1830s, but the woman that wrote it, it's a very, very offensive portrait of an
right,
ancestor, but it's also the most detailed representation that sort of I have of who this person was. So that might be part of why these issues were in my mind and came about to be represented in the way they did, because they
right, but like,
represent a larger set of issues for me in terms
right.
of. Mm,
No,
go
no, no. I'm sorry. I don't want to cut you off, but because I want to get this out. So
ahead.
two things. One was that the University of North Carolina
Yeah, yeah.
thing. Okay. Oh, well, okay, right. And everybody go to all of Lady Hubbard's Twitter, her Instagram, her Facebook. Go to all of that because she can explain all of that because I know exactly what she's talking about there. But then just let everyone know who hasn't read The Rip King that Mr. Sitwell's one of his many traumas is the destruction of a Black town.
Right. In the South. Yes.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and there was many of that, and then there was the erasure of that, and then there was the big lie. And I don't want to get too political because this is not what we're talking about. But then you can have the what's happening with the erasure of the power of Black voters. I don't want to conflate that with the
Yeah,
Rip
but
King.
and
It's
the
not
thing that
about that.
happened Mr. Sitwell, it happened a lot. Actually, it
Yes.
happened
Yeah.
very often. And in the book, there's a story about a mule, which
Yeah. Oh,
I
yes. Of
actually
course.
got from. It's an account of a race riot that took place. I can't remember where in the city, but that I read, and it did begin with someone shooting a mule
That's
that
right.
a
Yeah. Yeah.
white person from the neighboring town had said he would buy from him, but then he never paid him. And
Right.
so he went, the black man went and shot the mule, and it started this
Right.
huge.
And lady, and if memory serves me correctly, that's where like a black child is murdered.
In that happened in Chicago.
Right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
The
Yeah. Yeah.
Chicago riots
Yeah.
began with
Yeah.
a black child swimming and apparently wandering into the white beach.
And
And
without knowing that it was a white beach.
well, no, I mean, I
Yeah.
don't think so. I don't know. I'm
Yeah.
certainly
Yeah.
didn't think he thought the penalty would be, they were throwing rocks at him and he drowned. And that's
Right.
how the Chicago riot started, right?
Right.
So the
Yeah.
one you're referring to, yeah.
Right. Well, one of the many Chicago rebellions.
Right. So
Yeah.
that's also in terms of setting it there, in terms of thinking about the vulnerability of children again. To that's kind of very sad and grisly that you could be swimming and cross some invisible line, and the penalty is that you will be stoned to
Is
death
that you could lose your life, you know.
as a child. Yes, yes.
Now, talk about Trayvon Martin and the impetus for the Rib King's development.
Well, that's what I was, when I said I was responding to things that were going on at the time, because I started writing this while I was writing the previous novel, The Talented Ribkins. And again, that was very much in the news. And that was when I first started, the Black Lives Matter hashtag. I was also very struck by the reaction to it as well, which I thought was very illuminating. But again, it had to do with violence against children, racial violence against minors. I'll say, and so that's what I meant when I said it was in response to things that were very pressing on my mind. That is primarily what I'm referring to, was the
Right,
reaction to that.
right. Wow.
Mhm.
And we always think about Emmett Till and the four little girls and so many unnamed
Mhm.
children who lost their lives. And really, history is not remarked upon them at all. So I thank you for, as I'm sure we all do, for the Rib King and honoring lost children. And Mr. Sitwell, in his own way, trying to help, the orphans, in which in the first half,
Yes.
you can make up your own mind. I think he was quite good to those children.
He's
Um,
trying to be, definitely.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And what I want everyone to know is that Lady Hubbard and I, our editing, our working model is, I ask questions and then she answers those questions. Like I don't go into Lady Hubbard's work to try to find out what's not working. That's not my goal. I
Mm.
literally go into her work asking questions like, well, why did this happen? Or what happened here? Or what can we do here? And my editing process with such a superb talent is to get out of my way to make sure that she's presented a narrative that not only that she feels proud and happy about, but also that I've done the very best job that I can as an editor to ask her all these questions. So when she's ready to release this project into the world, her name will be the only name on it. It won't be mine. But I will have done all I possibly could have, not only editorially, but also with our marketing, publicity, all of our teams, to make sure that it has the best possible opportunity to have visibility and shine, and that it's just like the best perfect adult that you want to put out there to say, okay,
Mm.
wow, this is someone that you need to know in terms of a narrative. And so that's there. Um, so, lady, what were some of the most challenging moments, with or without having me as an editor, or just you with Aisha, that you faced? And I'm very interested in this, about bringing the two halves of uh, August Sitwell and Jenny Williams together, because we had a lot of conversations about that.
What was the most difficult part?
No, no, not difficult, challenging in terms of bringing that one, the first half, August Sitwell, the groundskeeper, and Jenny Williams, the maid, because you've done something that I think is extraordinary when you've written two separate halves that are different but somehow all come together.
Well, that's what I was trying to do. That was hard because I did not want Ginny's section to sound or feel like Mr. Sitwell's, but then I wanted them to be connected. So sort of just working through how to do that was difficult. It was at times difficult and challenging and went through a lot of different permutations. So also I wanted her section to be shorter, I remember. I wanted it to be
No,
shorter than his. So
and I just have to tell you, I don't know whether we went. I don't know whether it was that we went to a meal together,
uh-huh.
and I was trying to, I giving you notes and my feedback or whatever, and and there's a pivotal part of the plot that I won't give away here, and I think I was trying to get you to say, not. I'm like, okay, well, lady, can you just let everybody know just earlier what happened? Because there's something extraordinary that happens that's going to change Jenny's life forever.
Mm.
And I was like, well, can we let everyone know that a little earlier? And you said, well, you do realize what this novel is about. I was like, yes, I do.
That's funny. That's
I
funny.
don't want to name the restaurant, but I'm just saying when we were upstairs at that restaurant when we had that meal, and I was like, and you did, and you ultimately did, because I think it was 30 pages later or 20 pages later in part two, and then you got it up to at least, I think, 3 pages, which in part two, because I I think that turns everything around.
Which part? I don't know what. I'm sorry. I don't.
Um, the way that part one ends, the
Mhm.
reader doesn't know.
Oh, I extended the first part.
And then in part two,
Right.
you
I
had
did
it
the first
extended
section.
that out,
That's right. I did
And
it.
I'm like,
That's
let
right.
them know now, so then we could get to the Jenny part
Mhm.
where Jenny can live her life. And yes, she's sick of him and all of that. But if we just let them know, and I thank you for that. And
Mm.
so for any fiction author watching Center for Fiction, your editor does not, he or she means you well. Just that's all I'm saying. That's all I'm saying.
That's nice.
Yeah. Um, so now have you always been drawn to fiction?
Me?
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Well, you wanted to be
mostly.
a poet at first, right?
I don't know if I wanted to be anything. I wrote poetry. I wrote a lot of poetry when I was younger. I don't think there was much intentionality to it in terms of a career, but I did write a lot of poetry, which is
And when
why, yeah.
when you went to Princeton, were you going to study poetry or fiction or creative writing or?
No, no, I don't know. I mean, it was just something that I did when I was younger. I did for myself. I didn't really think of it in other terms. And I did. It's true. I did start writing fiction because I wanted to meet Toni Morrison, and I wanted to.
And you did.
I did, yes. But that was, yeah. So that she obviously was very important to my
If
development as a young person. So yeah.
and so, were you working on the Talented Ripkins when you were in Professor Morrison's class?
No, no, not at all. No, not at all. No. Not at all. No. That I wrote and it was very different. I wish I was a more sophisticated writer when I knew her, actually. In retrospect, I'm like, "Oh my gosh, I wish I was more I was this is when I was like 18 and 19 years old that I knew her, right? When I was an undergraduate in college and I wrote it was pretty wild. A lot of the stuff I wrote. It's actually kind of she was very supportive and encouraging, but it was definitely not a novel. No.
Okay, so lady, two things. One, she blurbed your debut novel, and
Yes.
I'm sure she would have blurb the Rib King had she still been with us.
I'm
And
so happy I got it together to finish a novel and to show it to her. I cannot tell you how much that meant to me that I was able to do that. Because it took a while for me to have something to show her. So I was very happy that when I finished it and I could show it to her, and you know what I mean? So
I do, because there are only a handful of people that Toni Morrison has blurbed since she became a full-time novelist after she left Random House as an editor, doing an extraordinary job of with Angela Davis and Lucille Clifton and again Gail Jones and my favorite Toni K. Bambara. I mean, it's extraordinary. So who were some of the poets that when you were interested in poetry that inspired you?
I'm trying to think. Oh my gosh, what kind of writers did I like back then? This is when I was very young. I know I liked just writers. Amiri Baraka,
Hmm.
Zora Neale Hurston, certainly Toni Morrison. Jean Toomer has inspired me to do certain things. Juan Rulfo has inspired me to do certain things. Clarice Lispector has inspired me to do certain things. When I was trying to figure out what a plot was, I read a lot of detective fiction, like Chester Himes and what's his name, Dashiell Hammett. I read a lot of stuff. I pulled from a lot of things and a lot of people, and they a lot of different types of writers inspire me. So it's kind of hard to narrow.
No. I mean, of course, no. One of the one of the more amazing things about Toni K. Bambara, the more I read about her, and of course, you know, there will never be another original like Lady Hubbard, but that Toni K. Bambara really read, although she was but she played with so many forms, the short story, the novel, Gorilla My Love is so brilliant. But I believe she was a fan of Edna St. Vincent Millay.
Mm.
Uh, and I'm a fan of Edna St. Vincent Millay, but Lucille Clifton and so many others. So, what would be your advice? We're here at the Center for Fiction. What would be your advice for burgeoning, upcoming fiction writers, and also writers who are sort of stuck in that sort of mid-list category, which you have such an incredible future ahead for you, not only with the talented Ripkins, but what you've done with the Rip King, which has been met with so much praise and so much public support. And we want to continue to support the Rip King, but we know that you have so many more projects ahead of you. But what would you say to upcoming writers or people who feel like, I did a novel, but I don't know what's going on with the industry, or what would you say?
Well, well, to upcoming writers, I know I would say that perseverance is key, and that it's very important to try to retain your own voice and your own vision, and it's very important to figure out how to believe in yourself and not wait for other people to do that, right? You have to find all that inside of you. I'd say to read a lot and to write all the time. It's not an easy pursuit. I really enjoy writing, but I think it took a while for me to try to conceptualize it as like a profession. I don't think I initially thought of it that way. And it's difficult. I think it's very difficult, and I think you really have to believe in yourself and respect your own voice. And you have to, tell yourself, because it's probably true that somebody needs to hear that voice, right? Someone needs
Yeah.
you to try to keep going. And again, it is very important um that people respect their own voices and stay true to that, and just have fortitude and strength. Yeah.
I believe we have a few questions, but before I get into this, and this has been amazing, lady, I can we can host a telethon together. um, I enjoy hearing your voice, whether on page um, or viscerally, just all the time. But did you ever read the anthology Black Women Writers at Work?
I don't think so. I don't know.
I'll get it to you. But Maya Angelou, who never wrote a novel, but there was a Intezaki Shang. Everybody's in it. Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, and they're really looking at people's processes for work. And Maya Angelou talked about how she worked, and I said that she rented a hotel in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, away from her home, and she would bring three things with her. Well, four things. She would bring a card table, a deck of cards, some bourbon, and the Bible, and
Oh,
her notepad and her pen and paper. And there would be days where nothing would come. And then there would be days where everything would come, but she had to do that ritual. Do you have a ritual when you write?
I don't know. I get up, I write, I try to write. My ritual is to write. So I try to write every day. And it's usually at 5 in the morning because I have 3 kids, as you know. But my ritual is to write. And then I don't know, I don't even, I mean, I just write literally, like in terms of not being able to come up with something. I just write right through that. So it probably feels very different for me because I just keep writing. Because a lot of times it's just me trying to figure something out in my head, right? What it is
Right,
I'm actually trying to do. And so for me, the best way to deal with that is to just keep writing and
right.
ask myself questions and see what answers I can come up with. So it's like a running dialogue every single day. I do
And
that.
I thank you for it. So we have some questions. So Martinia, please forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name. Starosta said, how long did the process take you from manuscript to final book? And I'm thinking this is the Rip King.
Uh-huh. From manuscript, so like
From
once it was
manuscript to final
actually
book.
written. Um, oh gosh. Well, you might be able to answer that, Patrick. How long did it
Yeah,
take?
no, I felt that the Rip King was in really good shape. And I felt that Ladee was a wonderful collaborator partner in terms of the part of the process in which she would have Ms. Hubbard would have someone look at the text and to provide feedback. The It wasn't lengthy, but it was important. I felt it was critical. Was the cover,
Right. That took a long
and
time.
that took a long time.
Yeah.
And and I felt that that was time well spent.
Well, I think it's a beautiful cover.
I
I
think it's
do.
an extra. I think it's an iconic cover because
So
we're trying to do a cover that's a novel that's looking at iconography, and um Judith Kerr, our extraordinary publisher, and Tracy Sherrod, the vice president and editorial director, they were like, wow, this is a cover. And normally for a book, a second, third, fourth book or whatever, you would think about the blurbs. And we were like, we have to get this cover right. Like normally you would think, well, we could get this from this person and that person, but we were like, we have to get this cover right. And once we got the cover right, we were like, this says this cup me. I don't know about you, Ladee, but it says everything that no one else could say.
mhm.
Like, well, come into this book, just
Yeah, no, I do. I really love it. For me because it did take so long. I can see so many previous incarnations of the cover.
You want to hold it up, Ladee?
So
You
it
wanna hold it-
finally came together. It's
Yes.
like all these different incarnations that we went over. I was like, oh my gosh, and they're little hints of them. All, you know what I mean? It was like they
Yeah.
all finally, after much, um, yeah, a long time. So the cover actually took a very long time. It's true.
Yeah, but it was well worth it, you know, and we were never going to go out there without anything that you were not pleased with or that did not represent what you were trying to do. And it was complicated in
Mhm.
on so many levels, but we got to it. So Cassie Rose or Casey Rose says, Patrik mentioned going through 3 or 4 iterations of the book. What does that author editor process look like? How does that play out? Can you explain for those of us who don't know the editorial process behind the scenes?
What did you about 3 or 4 iterations?
I think I remember about 3 or 4 iterations, but um
Did it
I never altered
right.
I never altered the action any of the a Lady Hubbard is a skilled writer. So I never went in. I would only ask her about the motivations about characters. Why are they doing this? Why is this happening?
Right.
Um, and then for the second half, Lady, if I can, I want to speak candidly. I felt that that there were I felt that there was a lot going on in Jenny's chapter, but
Yeah.
that was intentional.
It is
And
intentional.
because
Yeah.
it had to look.
Not a lot going on. That did not change. It still is. But no, it was intentional because
It
it's
was intentional, yeah.
it is her perception of her reality is much more chaotic, right?
Right, and
Yeah.
there's also a decade apart
Yes.
from she and Mr. Sitwell. A decade has passed.
Right.
And then
A lot
where
has changed.
he um and this and listen, any fiction editors out there or any editors out there who are part of this conversation, um, just pray for an editor like Lady Hubbard or whatever altar you bow down to. Just ask for that because it really helps you as an editor because um, there was a reason why Mr. Sitwell was performing the way
Yeah.
that he did in part 1. But
Right.
then Jenny, who you will learn in part 2, is also a performer, but a professional performer. And
Yeah.
so then you get why, because I don't know whether I told you this or not. I don't think I told you this, Lady. I called up Aisha and I said, well, in part 1, Mr. Sitwell is being so kind to Jenny. And then later I had to think, but it's not about him, it's about her. It's about
Yeah.
her response to him because
Yeah,
she's
because he
performing. And
traumatizes
then
her.
you pick it up in part 2. Wow. So yeah. Yeah.
His behavior is part of her trauma, but it by
Exactly.
part
Yes.
two.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. And
So
part 1 and part 2.
yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
So, but I think, I mean, you don't do well. I don't. I could go. I don't know how much time we have actually, because that's actually
I think we have 5 more minutes.
okay.
But somebody else has another question.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. How did the story evolve from manuscript to final book? What were your
Mm.
biggest challenges and how did you overcome those in your collaboration?
That's very similar to the other question.
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think I don't know what your habit is when you acquire it because things I imagine go through so many. I imagine it's true of most of the books you've acquired that they come to you in a pretty. I mean, they can't be that. I mean, they kind of have to be basically what they are. Like you don't really acquire like really rough drafts
Yeah,
though.
no, I mean,
Yeah.
fiction is very different from nonfiction.
Is that
And
is that true in nonfiction? Like
a
yeah.
nonfiction kind of comes in as a proposal with
Right.
fiction. I can tell you that, and without calling anyone out, um, the Red King came in so taut, so tight that it was a gift. But then I was so amazed and humbled that you listened to the suggestions that I had, and that you explained to me exactly what you were trying to do with the narrative. So I didn't have to do as much work as I have with other novels, but you were not a debut novel. You know,
Right.
you had already published a novel. So with debuts, it's a little complicated, you know, and you would have such a firm grip on the characters and the themes and the ideology and I'm a lover of history, as you know, and so there were all of these historical references, cultural references that you were making that some people may get or some people may not get. That I was thrilled to go along for the ride, but also cognizant that you were looking for guidance, and so
Mm,
I always wanted to be at the wheel when you
mm.
needed me, and I enjoyed the collaboration. So someone just said, "Hi, Ladee. I love how protective you are of your political messages within your art. How did you work together to balance your political objectives with the other parts of the narrative story?" And that's from Janetta Craigwell Graham.
That's an interesting question. That's a very interesting question. I think that certain things inspire me to want to write because writing is part of how I work through and figure out what I think about things or what I feel about things. That's part of why I like writing. Um, so it tends to be inspired by something that is moving to me, that's happening in the real world, right? And then it's like trying to think about how this relates to my perceptions of like identities or characters, right? And sort of trying to dramatize questions as opposed to answers. So I don't know, I don't want to be like, you know, they say like didactic. I do really think at the core that it's about people, because that's actually such a complicated thing, right? Being a human being in the midst of this world. So it ultimately it's not really about the politics. It's about how people experience the politics and endure it. So to me, it's always about the characters. What does this mean for this character? How does this express itself for this character? Because I want them to be real people. You know what I mean? It's true. It's like I often am writing things where I'm interested in sort of themes or questions or things that are going on in the world, but I am very interested in how that impacts actual people. So it becomes for me very much about my relationship with a character. That I don't know if that might sound weird too,
No,
because
no,
they're not real people. They're like
no,
things
no,
that I
no,
invented,
no,
but
no. And Janetta picked up on a good point because in the Jenny chapter that fast forwards a decade later, Lady and I believe we had numerous conversations about what was that political movement of Black Pan-Africanism and um, can I talk about that, Lady?
are you
About
talking about Garvey?
the
Marcus
Garveyites?
Garvey?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I don't. That's
And
fine. I guess that's what I mean. And that represents a certain energy, right, of the era that I think is really important to acknowledge. It was very transformative for a lot of people without wanting to get into the specific details of it because it's not about that, but there are references to it in
right,
the
and Jenny as a character through the editing process is understanding all of this in real time. Like
mm,
everything but Jenny feels very urgent. It feels very she's got to get things done, you know,
mm.
and survive. Whereas Mr. Sitwell is I've got to survive, but now I found out this thing, and oh my God, you know, so he's more reactive and she's more proactive in her section.
She's very
I,
proactive.
yeah.
She's very proactive.
I find. And so, so we have another question, lady. Someone says, "Lady, thank you for your wonderful reading. You mentioned learning about plot by looking at detective fiction. Is
Yeah.
that an element of fiction that was more challenging for you? What comes more easily for you, and how do you tend to approach world building with your novels?"
Well, that was the most challenging thing for me. I just couldn't, I mean, someone can explain things to you and it just was not my sensibility plots. Like right, you know what I mean? Like I just wasn't, I was always much more interested in in language and things like that. And it was very hard for me to, I learned a lot from reading, and like, they're good, they're good detective fictions, but they're all, the story is all predicated on plot. And some people are very artful with doing that. And some people manage to say a great deal, right, through structure and storytelling. And I remember I went through like a summer where I just read tons of detective novels and just thought about them and what they were doing, and also what they were doing differently from each other. So it was a good way for me just to sort of get my mind to think about that, right?
No, and I don't want to state the obvious, but Toni Morrison on her off time, she loved reading Ruth Rennell.
Yeah.
She did. She really did. She did.
It was very helpful. It was very helpful. So,
Yeah.
and I read a lot of Chester Himes. I
Oh,
read like
he's
all those.
he's the best.
Yeah, it's fascinating. Very
Yeah.
surreal. Very surreal as well. Very interesting work. But I did, and also like, like the Glass Key and the Postman Always, what is it? Postman Always Rings Twice, and like all those old classic, like those aren't really detective fictions. I read a lot of noir and stuff like that. But things that were very much about, plot, and like trying to set up, and one thing leads from here to the, in a linear fashion. I wasn't a very linear thinker. I don't
I,
think so. It was very
somehow I
helpful.
well,
Yeah, you can
somehow I
learn a
find that
lot from a lot of different types of literature. Do you know?
right. Well,
Yeah.
somehow I find that surprising. In our last minutes, and again, thank you, Kristen, and the Center for Fiction for hosting this conversation with the amazing Ladee Hubbard and the masterpiece that is the Rib King. Ladee, what do you want people? People are going to have so many interpretations of the Rib King, which is what one of the things I loved most about the novel. That when I that the last line, I think I get chills still thinking about it, and all that you bring the reader through in terms of the journeys of so many amazing domestic characters that many people don't know, and will probably never know. But what do you want people to take away from the Rib King when they finish it?
Oh, there's a lot of, I mean, because there's a lot going on. I think, again, ultimately for me, it is about really thinking about how much African Americans have contributed, again, to American culture, beginning before they were even acknowledged as human beings. That, and I don't mean in terms of just labor, I mean in terms of artistry and ideas, how much they contributed. And again, the whole thing about products, right? Originally, Black people were commodities or considered commodities. So there's something particularly brutal and cruel about the ways in which Black identity continually is commodified in that way, right? So part of the struggle to be recognized as producers of culture as opposed to products or commodities, right, is still with us today. But we have, it's stunning to me how much people of color in general have committed, contributed to mainstream culture, whether they are recognized or acknowledged for having done so or not. So that's really what, it's a happy story. It's a feel good story at the end. People keep growing. They make their healing salves. They keep healing themselves, right? They find a way to keep doing it. So it's just an acknowledgement of that for me. So again, it's not, when the book, I don't have answers. It's more about my exploration of questions and the connections between different things, trying to understand them myself. So that's what actually came out at the end.
Right. Um, I wholeheartedly appreciate from such a space of humility the journey that the invented world that you created um, took me on, and it's not about me, but then to be at a publisher that then we can bring this journey out into the world. It is so extraordinary. I just implore everyone to read The Rib King. It is such an amazing, remarkable, thoughtful, and inspiring, and also challenging look at perception.
Mm.
And no one does it better than Lady Hubbard. So, Lady, thank you so much for participating in this conversation.
Oh,
And now
thank
I'm going to
you.
turn it over to Kristen.
Thank
Okay,
you both
thank
so
you.
much. I loved listening to that, and I'm sure the audience did as well. And everyone, go and buy your copy of The Rib King if you haven't gotten already. Thank you all so much, and have a great night.
Okay,
Thank
thank
you.
you.